everybody. Welcome to the show. We have a great guest today. This is Dr. Alan Goldhamer, and welcome to the show, Dr. Alan.
It's a pleasure to be here.
It's been a long time since we last interviewed you, but uh, before we get started with the questions, can you briefly introduce yourself, who you are, and what you do, and then we'll get into some questions?
Well, my name's Alan Goldhamer. I'm the director of the TrueNorth Health Center in Santa Rosa, California. I've been there for 40 years. We've had 25,000 patients undergo medically supervised water-only fasting and the use of a whole plant food SOS-free diet to help them recover and maintain health.
Okay, great. So water-only fasting, which would be considered mostly long-term supervised water fasting. So how'd you get into this when you were growing up? Were you into health growing up?
I read a book by Herbert Shelton that said that health was the result of healthful living and that involved diet, sleep, exercise, and fasting. And so I got very interested in that. I have to admit, I was inspired partly by my uncle, who was a medical doctor, who said that diet and fasting was ridiculous nonsense and that rather than go into that type of field, I should become a communist spy.
So that inspired you to not listen to him and the doctor and
Well, my father took me aside. He said, son, I don't know anything about alternative medicine, but anything that makes him that angry and mad, it can't be bad. So stick to your guns and good luck to you.
so did what kind of schooling did you have when you were
Well, I
going?
went to chiropractic college in Portland, Oregon, osteopathic college in Sydney, Australia, and I studied with Alec Burton, who at the time was the person who had the most experience doing medically supervised water-only fasting.
Okay, so before you read the book by Herbert Shelton, where was your mind at? Were you involved in health? Did you grow up healthy or sick? Were you just doing like everyone else?
Well, I was in fourth grade. I was pretty young, and I was interested in basketball. I was trying to become a better basketball player than my best friend, Doug Lyle. But unfortunately, he adopted the same diet and lifestyle habits, and now here we are. We're both 65. He still kicks my butt every time we play.
Wow. So you were 4 years old. I mean, in fourth grade when you read the book by Herbert Shelton.
Yeah, I was very young.
Wow. So up to that point, before you opened the center, how much fasting did you personally do?
Well, I had experimented with fasting a little bit. I was really fortunate, though. I was very healthy. I never, had any bad habits because I was so young when I got started. So I never drank or smoked or used coffee or, I've been a vegan SOS-free focused diet since I've been 16. So it's made it a little bit easier than people that have had to overcome a lot of addictions and bad habits.
So you've been a vegan since you were 16 years old.
Yeah, so this is the 49th year. So next year will be year 50 because I'm 65. So yeah.
Wow. And do you supplementate or have you over the years?
Yes, I supplement vitamin B12 as I recommend patients do that are on vegan diets because without the bacterial, sources of B12, you just don't get all the fecal contamination and other stuff on the vegan diet. So we do recommend supplementing B12. And for people that aren't able to get out in the sun enough and whose D is low, we'll sometimes supplement D as well.
Now, before you supplement people or before you work with people, do you do blood work before and after or during, or are you one of the
Yeah,
people?
we use all available non-invasive diagnostic tools, including blood and urine testing, as well as physical examination, review of history, etc.
So in your own life for the last 49 years you've been a vegan, have you ever gotten a situation where you said, I need to go on a long-term fast, or you just personally didn't need to do it?
Yeah, I've always done shorter term fasting preventatively. I did have to do one longer fast because I was in a basketball game and I hit somebody in the mouth with my elbow and got a human bite and it got a bit of an infection. So I had to do a little bit longer fast to resolve that. But generally, my fasts have been a week or less, which is what we advocate for people that are healthy. If you fast a week, you're stable. Usually that's enough to move on with. When people are sick, they'll fast up to 40 days at the True North Health Center.
Up to 40 days.
Yeah, so Moses, David, Elijah, Jesus, and our patients fast up to 40 days. I
Now,
don't do the longer fasts because when I trained with Dr. Burton, he was no longer doing long-term fasting. That is the fast between 40 and 100 days. And I asked him why he didn't do the long-term fasting any longer, because he used to. And he said because of the sleep deprivation. And I said, "Are you telling me they have more trouble sleeping after 40 days?" He goes, "Not the patients, me." It
That's
turns out when you do long-term fasting over 40 days, it gets a lot more delicate. You have to be a little bit more focused on the electrolyte balance and whatnot. So he decided early on that he would limit his fasting to 40 days and then recover people, and then if necessary, do it again.
Now, did he and you come up with that number of 40 days from the examples you gave in the Bible, or was it more diagnostically? How'd you come
Oh,
up
I'm
with
not sure exactly where that number came from, but it turns out that you can do up to 40 days without getting into too many complications for most people.
Now, I've read some books by a guy named Franklin back in the 70s who wrote some fasting books, and he was saying that 40-day fast that they did in the Bible was always with water. Some people say, well, when Moses fasted, it wasn't with water. Uh, what's your opinion about that?
Well, I wasn't there, so I really don't know what Moses did, but I wouldn't recommend fasting without water because that's not physiologically sound. You need a solute to take the toxic material that are mobilized in fasting and eliminate it without the water. All you're going to do is get dehydrated, shut down your kidneys.
Sure. I remember I met Willie Messer and I asked him, how often do you fast? And he told me, he goes, I don't need to fast. I don't overeat. So do you think that's a pretty appropriate answer for most people?
Well, I think that overeating is only one factor. Some people get exposed to environmental toxins. They live in places like, LA. And so even if they're eating healthy, I still think that the idea of periodic longer term fasting, if nothing else but diagnostically, I think is useful.
In terms of short-term fast, do you think everyone could and should do this by themselves at home, or do you think
Yes, I think everybody should fast on their own at home up to 16 hours every day. So I suggest that people not eat 3 to 4 hours before they go to bed at night. And if you're trying to lose weight, you can delay breakfast till you do some exercise in the morning. And that'll give you somewhere between a 12 and 16-hour fast every day. And that 8-hour feeding window, you want to limit yourself to exclusively whole plant foods that are free of added salt, oil, and sugar.
so what you just said is commonly known as intermittent fasting, even though it might have other names, but that's what it's called
Yeah,
today.
more specifically time restricted feeding, but yes.
Okay. So on that,
And then
so
occasionally, if you're going
yeah.
to do a longer fast, you want to do that with some medical support. So you have a medical history exam and lab to determine if you're a good candidate for fasting. You rest and hydrate during fasting to avoid dehydration, and you carefully refeed according to the protocol laid out in our book, Can Fasting Save Your Life? So we've written a book that summarizes the 22 papers we've published in the peer-reviewed literature. And that book gives patients the information to understand how do you determine if you're a good candidate for fasting, how to conduct a fast properly, and how to terminate a fast with appropriate refeeding. It not only provides the patient with the information they need, but it provides their doctor with the information they need to guide, support, and examine a patient effectively.
In terms of the short-term fast versus a fast where somebody should be prepared for it, everyone, your suggestion, if I'm hearing you correctly, everyone should and be capable of doing this intermittent fasting, correct?
Well, there are some complications. Some people are on medications and other things that need to be addressed. You certainly don't do long term fasting on medications. The 16 hours a day usually doesn't require people to modify their current medications. There
Yes, I'm
shouldn't be a
talking about
complication.
the 16-hour fast every day. Pretty much
Yeah,
everyone.
most people are able to do that. There are some people that wouldn't be advisable. And as I said, if weight management isn't a control, a 12-hour window may be more appropriate, certainly for children and others where it's challenging to get enough calories in that window when you're sticking strictly to high water content, low caloric density foods.
So let's take it from that overnight intermittent fast for 16 hours to the next level. There's a diet called the OMAD diet, which is eating once a day. So now you're fasting like 23 hours a night or 20 hours a
Yeah, I
night.
don't recommend that. It's very difficult to get enough calories of the right kind of food in one meal a day. When you fill the feeding bag up, you're getting between 5 and 700 calories in your stomach. So for people that need, say 2,000 calories on average a day, you're going to need to eat 2 or 3 times a day to get enough of those calories. If you don't, you're going to be in a chronic state of deprivation and you either get really skinny or you develop problems. So I think that people should eat healthfully every day during an 8-hour window and then fast 16 hours a day every day by not eating 3 to 4 hours before we go to bed. If you're going to do longer than that, then it's always the same protocol. Make sure you're a good candidate with history exam and lab. Rest during fasting, so you're not going to work, you're not driving, you're not doing all that stuff. and carefully refeed. And the protocol laid out in Can Fasting Save Your Life explains it takes half the length of the fast in order to properly refeed.
The number you said for people that need 2,000 calories a day, where does that come from?
Well, it's just an average. Some people need less, some people need more. If you're an athlete, you might, or a heavy worker, you may need as much as 3,500 calories a day. Somebody that's 6'8", 220 pounds needs a different caloric load than a person that's 5'2" and 100 pounds. And somebody that's 25 may burn more calories than a person that's 85. So a lot of this is individual, needs. But the way you tell is if you're getting enough calories, you should be able to sustain your optimum weight, health, and energy. If you're having trouble with that, it may be you're not getting enough caloric density.
Sure. And I've interviewed some health people that say they recommend fasting 1 day a week. So, regardless of how they're doing any intermittent fasting overnight for 16 hours or not, do you think the 1 day, 36-hour window fast is a healthy practice for healthy
I
people?
don't, because I think that the most expensive part of fasting biologically is those first 48 hours. You can fast for 16 hours and still have glycogen stores. Once you get beyond that, now you're going to start into gluconeogenesis where you're breaking down lean tissue. And so if you're going to go over 16 hours, in my opinion, you follow the same protocol, whether it's going to be 1 day, 2 days, 10 days, 20 days, 40 days, history exam, lab, and monitoring. You
Okay.
can get people into big trouble on even relatively shorter fasts, particularly if they have health concerns, they're on medications, or they're too active during fasting.
So, people that are doing 2 meals a day and doing the 16-hour window fast, you're recommending with water. So if they're doing like a green vegetable juice, is that, in your opinion, considered breaking the fast, or is that still equivalent enough?
Well, fasting is the complete abstinence of all substances except water and an environment of complete rest. Everything else is modified feeding. And if you're eating healthily, I don't care, if it's green juices, if it's salad, I mean, there's lots of different ways you can do feeding programs. And there's advantages and disadvantages to each. It depends if you're trying to gain weight, lose weight, recover health, maintain health, if you have high energy output, low energy output. So you have to take those things into consideration when you put a diet and lifestyle program together for an individual.
Well, when you talk about the fasting to help individuals in their situation, we look at their daily diets. Somebody who is eating a healthier diet and someone healthy, is it true they'll have a easier time with the fast than somebody that's pretty toxic and possibly even have a disease?
Well, if they're fasting intermittently every day with time restricted feeding, they're kicking in those enzyme systems, and it does seem to make it much easier for them to do a long term fast. People that are on a toxic waste diet, living on greasy, fatty, slimy, dead, decaying flesh and highly processed foods, and have higher levels of toxicity within their cells, are likely to have a much more what I call entertaining fast, where they have all kinds of untoward symptoms. The patients that are fasting regularly and they're eating healthfully, the fasting is rather boring. I mean, you go, you rest, your energy slows down, and that's the end of it. You don't have all the exciting healing crises that are associated with fasting people that are coming off conventional diets.
What would say the success rate of True North is for people that stick with the fast? Because I know there are probably
Well, it
some
depends on
people.
the condition. Like we published a paper on high blood pressure, 174 consecutive patients with high blood pressure, and 174 people achieved pressure low enough to eliminate medication. We just did a prospective study with our colleagues from the Mayo Clinic. 27 people with hypertension fasted, 26 were able to achieve entirely normal pressure without medication. One of them still required low dose medication. At 1 year follow up, the majority had still had normal blood pressure without meds, and 76% had maintained their weight loss. Now, they hadn't all been 100% compliant with a whole plant food SOS free diet, but they'd done well enough to keep off the fat. And when you keep off the fat, you keep off the visceral fat. When you keep off the visceral fat, the fat that accumulates around the organs that produces the inflammation that causes the disease, you can manage the condition properly. So, our success rate depends on the motivation of the patient. Highly motivated patients have pain, debility, and fear of death. They usually do quite well. People that's only goal is to lose some weight are going to struggle more.
Somebody that has something hereditary like high cholesterol in their family lines and their genes, if they go on a fast, will that lower their cholesterol, or will that have no effect because it's a heredity thing and not a diet thing?
Well, everything has genetic basis. And so, 62% of people by the age of 60 have hypertension, and most of their relatives did. It doesn't mean that they can't overcome it. In fact, all of them do. The essential hypertension patients, virtually all of them normalize. So hypercholesteremia, people come in with cholesterols of 600 milligrams percent, but even they oftentimes bring their cholesterol levels down to normal levels. So, the genetics certainly may be a predisposing factor, but they aren't necessarily a limiting factor. The epigenetics, or which are controlled by diet and lifestyle, often determine what your outcome is going to be.
From your diet standpoint, after being a vegan for 49 years, B12 being one of the major things that you'll supplement with, there's a lot of reports coming out now about essential fatty acids on a vegan diet, how you can get them, and so do you supplement with that or think about that
Well,
at all?
first of all, a vegan diet may be a crap diet because vegan, Coca-Cola is vegan, French fries are vegan, Oreo cookies are vegan. Vegan doesn't mean anything except that you're not eating animal foods. So it needs to be a whole plant food SOS free diet. So that means everything's whole plant foods, not processed vegan crap.
Sure.
So, some vegan diets are less healthy than people including animal foods in their diet. So we want to be really clear about that. So if a person's on a whole plant food SOS free diet and all of their calories are coming from whole foods, they're going to get the quantity and quality of the nutrients they need with the potential exception of B12 and vitamin D.
So where would they get their essential fatty
Essential
acids
fatty
from?
acids are abundantly rich. Well, first of all, remember your body takes omega-3 fatty acid and converts it to D-cosohexoxanic acid. So if you're including green vegetables in your diet, you have a very rich source of essential fatty acids. And some foods like flax seeds and walnuts are particularly rich in omega-3 fatty acids. So we do include things like flaxseed or walnuts up to an ounce a day in the diet, specifically to make sure there's an abundance of essential fatty acids. Also, some vegetables, particularly things like purslane and those kind of dark green vegetables, tend to be very rich as well. Most importantly, we don't increase the need for omega-3 artificially by increasing omega-6 fatty acids. So the higher omega, which comes from oil. So by eliminating all oil, you reduce the likelihood of artificially increasing the amount of omega-3 fatty acids that are necessary to stay healthy.
So, in your opinion, the flax seeds and the walnuts, and maybe perhaps even chia seeds, are efficient enough for somebody who's eating the proper diet without taking supplementation to get their omega
For
3?
for the vast majority of people, they do fine. There are some people that have trouble converting omega-3 fatty acid into docosahexaenic acid, and those people, worst cases, you could supplement a vegan source of DHA. They have algae sources of DHA now.
What way would you think that people can know if they have a trouble time converting it?
Well, you have two measures. You can measure it in the blood, it's simple enough, or you can actually look clinically. If you have symptoms that you're concerned about, that might warrant you to justify your blood testing, or you can do a clinical trial, increasing omega-3 fatty acid and seeing how it works on the dry skin or whatever it was your concern was.
Sure. And when it comes to the diet and the food, what kind of diet? We know you're saying SOS, whole food, plant based, but there are many different
I didn't
ways
say
that.
plant-based because
Okay.
plant-based doesn't mean anything. It could be
Okay.
based on plants and be crap. I said exclusively whole plant
Oh,
food
oh,
that's free of salt, oil, and sugar. So a whole plant food SOS free diet.
okay.
SOS stands for the international symbol of danger and also salt, oil, and sugar. The chemicals that are added to food to stimulate dopamine production that fool our satiety and is the reason why people are fat, sick, and miserable.
When you say sugar, some people will say, fruit has a lot of sugar. So we know if it's in the fruit, it's one thing, but what if it's extracted from the fruit? It's the
Well,
fructose.
there's a big difference between whole fruit and refined carbohydrates and sucrose. So even fruit today, these hybridized fruits that we eat are high in sugar, low in fiber. So I do think you have to be careful. I wouldn't recommend a fruitarian diet, for example, today. I think you need to get a lot of green vegetables in the diet to neutralize the impact of carbohydrate. Everything ultimately uh, uh, depends on to the degree you process it. Whole fruits are better than fruit juices. Dried fruits are more concentrated than whole fruits. That's why we say a whole plant food SOS free diet. And if you
Okay.
do that, you'll get the carbohydrates, fats, and proteins that you need.
So somebody who is eating mostly fruit or a fruitarian diet or something like this, we know because of the hybridization of food and the amount of sugar in it, you say you would limit it. So do you have
Well,
num
what I'd said was you got to get enough greens to neutralize it. So by volume, it's going to be mostly vegetables because vegetables only have 100 calories a pound, fruit 300 calories a pound. You could eat a lot of fruit in the diet and still be healthy if you get enough greens. In a practical sense, though, we recommend two vegetable-based meals a day, one fruit-based meal.
okay, as
Want
percentage
greens
wise,
with it.
do you get in percentage wise or weight wise in terms of when somebody's eating fruit, like 25% of their diet from fruit or 30%?
Well, it
Like,
depends on the person. You have people that have glucose sensitivity problems, diabetics, so that we might exclude fruit from the diet and go a strictly vegetable-based diet. You have other people that could get a significant percentage of calories, maybe as much as 50% of their calories from fruit, and still do extremely well. For most people, though, here's how the diet looks for that we find that works well. They have maybe fruit and greens in the morning, perhaps with an ounce of flax seeds or walnuts or something of that nature. Two huge salads a day, two large platters of steamed vegetables, and enough carbohydrates so they don't get too skinny. So if people are sensitive to beans or grains, get rid of those. Just eat more starchy vegetables. That's fine. We do use steamed and starchy vegetables though, because part of the reason we become human is we got enough calories in order to support the brain. Remember, your brain's your biggest burner of glucose. So, for the human being to function and maintain this large bulbous neuronal net at the end of our spinal column, we need a pretty high caloric load. And so one of the ways that we did that is we used heat to process carbohydrates. And so that's where steamed starchy vegetables are so helpful.
well, what would you think about the raw food diet?
I think it's for most people, it ends up being a problem because it ends up being a very high sugar, high fat diet. So they're eating a lot of nuts, a lot of fruit, and we know what happens to people on high fruit, high fat diets eventually. Now, it's so much better than the standard American diet. People do okay for a while, but eventually you'll see the same problems on, especially fruitarians: teeth, nail, hair, gum problems, emotional volatility, recurrent infections. And then you put a bunch of vegetables in those people, and then they do better. So they're not getting the toxicity of the dead, decaying flesh diet, but they're getting a very high sugar, high fat diet, which may not be the best long-term strategy. That's why there's never been a culture of people that have subsisted on fruit. There's no fruit eating people. Almost every culture has been based on some type of starchy vegetable of one material or other.
Sure. So when you say starchy vegetable, give us an example of what you're talking about.
Hubbard squash, butternut squash, kabocha squash, sweet potatoes, potatoes. For people that can tolerate it, non-glutinous grains like rice, millet, quinoa. For people that are able to digest them, lentils, peas, beans, these things of these natures. If you look at the 3 or 4 billion people on the planet that make less than $5 a day, they live on the same basic substance, which is rice and beans. And they live on rice and beans because the cost per calorie of rice and beans is the lowest cost on the planet. To live on a raw fruit and vegetable diet, the cost per calorie is 10 times more. So it's a very elitist diet, not very practical for the majority of people living on the planet.
And when you say long term, people are going to experience some issues. There are a lot of
Yes.
people out there that do fruitarian diet. They say they've been eating fruit only for 4 or 5 years. What are you saying long term? 20 years, 10 years?
Yeah, no, no, no. Even a few years, it starts showing up. Their teeth start falling out. They get recurrent infections, bladder infections. They have emotional volatility. They have difficulties from being on a high sugar, high fat diet. Whether it's a high sugar, high fat plant-based diet or a high sugar, high fat refined carbohydrate, the problems end up being very similar. And you'll
Sure.
see this, if you go to fruit, I lecture at fruitarian groups all the time. People do great for a year or two because they're off the standard American diet until they get into depletion issues. And if you take those same fruitarians and give them enough greens, then they generally thrive. And I've treated like so many vegans and fruitarians and vegetarians. I mean, it becomes very obvious what works long term wise. Now there are fruitarians out there that are thriving, but they're generally getting large amounts of green vegetables in their diet, and they're usually using juicing and all kinds of other ways of getting increased caloric density. And I got news for you: we've been cooking foods a lot longer than we've been juicing foods. So I don't have a problem with if you want to use vegetable juices and stuff, that's fine. But that's not any more natural than using steam to process starchy vegetables, as far as I'm concerned.
Sure, sure. And what's your opinion of sprouts and microgreens in a diet?
Yeah, I like microgreens and sprouts partly because you can grow them all year, you can control it yourself. And in this world where even organic foods have been kind of bastardized, taking control, having a garden, growing sprouts is good. In fact, I used to run a company called Perfect Sprouts, and that's what put me through chiropractic college and built TrueNorth Health Center. The sale of that business, and we're a commercial sprout grower. We grew 2,000 pounds of sprouts a week. We supplied over 100 restaurants and grocery stores and whatnot. So I'm very familiar with growing sprouts on a very large scale. And I got no problem with sprouts. But, the best food from my viewpoint is the stuff that grows in the dirt that you grow. And, if you've got a garden or raised beds, you can really grow a lot of product. It's amazing how much you can grow. in a relatively small space. We have 2-acre farm that we grow food for TrueNorth Health Center, and we have about 80 fruit trees and raised beds and whatnot. It's amazing how much stuff you can produce.
Absolutely. What's your opinion about the Hippocrates Health Institute diet way of eating? Because it sounds, besides the cooked food, similar to what you're saying.
Well, I think the Hippocrates don't represent their diet as a day in and day out diet. It's a cleansing diet, and they put lots of sprouts and greens and wheatgrass juice and all that. That's not what we do. What we advocate is exclusively whole plant foods. We can include sprouts, certainly, but we wouldn't suggest that people would live on that only. That's not the diet that we're recommending. And I think it's a more difficult to sustain diet for the people that are using it. But I think they're representing it as a cleansing diet for people because they're not doing water fasting. In fact, I know the folks they're well. They send us a lot of patients for water only fasting. We treat a lot of the staff. And for people that don't eat meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, oil, salt, and sugar, they're going to do really well. But a long-term sustainable diet, in my opinion, for most people, is going to include raw fruits and vegetables and steamed and starchy vegetables, small amounts of nuts and seeds, and exclude animal foods and highly processed foods. That's the diet we recommend. Now, can people do other versions of diet and do well? Great, no problem. And if you're thriving, your values are good, your numbers, your energy is good, congratulations. But don't assume that cooked food is poison food, that steamed vegetables are some horrific poison and you got to live on raw fruits and dates and nuts. And because that's not what my experience has been, the long-term sustainable health promoting diet for people. And listen, I've been in practice for 40 years. I've got patients now that are in their 80s and 90s that we started off in their 40s. And the story is the same over and over again. Everybody they know is dead. All the people they used to live with are dead. Even their kids are dying now, sometimes from heart attacks and strokes because they're not following a health promoting diet. So I've seen it in my patients, long-term sustainable. They live, and when they die, they tend to have short durations of debility. They don't spend 20 years unable to talk or move, lying in a nursing home bed, waiting for people to come and change their diaper. They live their life, they reach their genetic potential, they go to sleep, and they don't wake up.
Besides what we're eating, how important is it, even if somebody's eating 2 meals a day, is the time they eat, like late night eating and eating before going to bed? How dangerous is this as a practice, no matter what you're eating?
Well, I think that it does matter. I want people to stop eating 3 to 4 hours before they go to sleep and to go to sleep at a reasonable hour. You're designed to go to sleep when it gets dark. So, if you're staying up at all hours with lights, watching news broadcasts and stressing yourself out, you may not do as well as if you got to bed at a decent hour. Don't eat 3 to 4 hours before you go to sleep. If you're trying to lose weight, get up and do some exercise before you start eating in the morning. Limit your feeding window to 8 hours and eat exclusively whole plant foods. If you do that, and you're a male, you're going to lose 3 pounds of weight down to optimum weight. If you're a female, you're going to lose 2 pounds of weight down to optimum weight. And you're going to reverse, many of the diseases associated with dietary excess. Whether you fast or you don't fast, even if you limit your fasting to the 16 hours a day, over time, you're going to recover from most of the things that ail people.
And there's a diet out there that people are eating and having success with that. I know you don't agree with the diet, but why are people having success with the carnivore diet?
Well, of course, you're going to have success with a carnivore diet because it doesn't include the ultra processed food that make up 80% of the average person's diet. When you get rid of the sugars and the refined carbohydrates, anything is going to be an improvement on that. Now, the carnivore diet, remember, those people were often eating animal foods 3 times a day anyway. They were already shoving their face full of dead, decaying flesh. All they did was got rid of the refined carbohydrates. So temporarily, they're going to do great. They're going to lose weight. They're going to function better. They're going to have less allergic tendencies because of the food allergies they've gotten rid of with the ultra processed foods. In the long run, they're going to get sick and die a slow and painful death because you're going to get the gallbladder disease and the heart disease and the cancer down in the long run. But in the short run, being overweight is so dangerous. Anything you do, even taking these GLP inhibitors, even though, think about what these Ozempic are doing. You inject this drug at an inordinately high expense forever, but it makes you sick enough that you don't eat quite as much of the ultra processed food. And so you lose weight. Now, in the long run, it's a disaster. But in the short run, losing all that fat and visceral fat causes some benefit. If you go on a dead Dr. Atkins diet, may his soul rest in peace, sure, you'll get some short-term benefit possibly until your gallbladder gives up or you develop gastric paresis or you end up with, problems with colon cancer or whatever your long-term consequences are going to be. Over the short run, getting all that fat off by not eating the ultra-processed foods is beneficial. But what if you just went on a whole plant food SOS-free diet and didn't inject yourself with some toxic drug? You'd lose 2 pounds a week if you're a female and 3 pounds a week if you're a male. That's 100 to 150 pounds a year weight loss. Now, the problem is you have to give up your addictions. And that's the issue. The appeal to the drugs is you can keep being an addict, but lose some weight temporarily. Our approach is much more difficult because you have to give up the artificial stimulation of dopamine in your brain, and that's very difficult. But think about this: failure rate for drug addicts and alcoholics exceeds 90% for 1 year. They can't even stop drinking or using drugs for a year, 90% of the time. But to lose 5% of your body weight and keep it off for a year, the failure rate's higher than that. It's 95%. So it's harder for people to lose weight than it is to give up drug addiction. And part of that is because with drug addiction, it's very clear you have to stop using the drug or drinking the alcohol. But with food, they tell them, well, just eat less or change the color of your meat from red to white or put your food on a smaller plate or, there's all kinds of nonsense out there, all kinds of diets. They all work temporarily. And then people's health gets compromised. I'm concerned about what's going to make the last 20 years of people's life the best, not just what's going to give you some short-term symptomatic effect. And so hard work, whole plant food, SOS-free diet, very difficult to do. I understand that, but it's what works long-term. And for people that do it, they don't look back and say, oh, I wish I'd gone on Ozempic.
Sure. What kind of water do you use when you do your fasting?
We use purified water. So we use fractionally steam distilled water, kind of laboratory grade distilled water. But you could use other types of purification, reverse osmosis and whatnot. You just want to get the hydrogenated halocarbons and the chlorine and the fluoride and all the other crap out of the water. Spring water, you never know if it's going to be pure or not. Even rainwater, which would be distilled water, can be contaminated with materials from the atmosphere. So we use either mechanically or electrically purified water.
So, would you suggest or say the cleanest water we can ingest is either distilled or RO water?
Yeah, distilled water is that's why laboratory
Uh,
grade water is distilled water.
So now, if for your regular diet, besides fasting, is that the type of water you use for yourself?
Absolutely. The idea that it's going to suck the minerals out of your body is nonsense. You're not drinking water for its mineral content. And in fact, a lot of the minerals in there you want to avoid, lead, mercury, etc. What you're you get more minerals in one apple than you're going to get in all the water you're going to be drinking. So let's not think of water as a primary source of minerals, good or bad minerals. Let's think of our vegetables as a source of minerals. And the intestinal tract is not a two-way gradient. You're not sucking all the minerals out of your body. That's just nonsense. That's an advertising product from the people that used carbon filters because they were competing with the water distillers.
Sure.
And
And
so,
if you are,
it's just
yeah, I'm sorry, finish what you say.
it's just nonsense.
Yeah.
Some of this stuff is not based on physiology.
Yeah. So if you are going to use distilled water, does it matter what type? If you distill tap water, it's perfectly healthy and fine.
Well, you can distill any water. It ends up being just H2O if you have a good distillation system and a post-filter system.
So it doesn't matter
So
if
the
there
way
are
we do it is we
toxins.
filter the water, we then steam distill it, and then it comes through a filter at the end. So anything that comes off at the same temperature as water would be filtered by your solid carbon block
Yeah, but I'm
filters.
saying you filter the water first. What would it make a
Yeah.
difference if somebody was doing this at home and they didn't filter the water first? Does it make a difference?
Well, you'll get a little higher quality product if you filter it, and most distillers have a pre-filter on it.
Okay.
What ends up happening is if you don't filter the water, you get a lot of mineral buildup in the tank, and so you have to service your distiller more effectively. It just makes more sense to filter it, distill it, and then post filter it, which is how most distillation systems are set up. But yeah, I mean, it
Okay.
doesn't matter. You can take the worst water, you steam distill it, and it's going to get rid of the majority of materials that are contaminating the water.
And what's the difference between the distilled water and the RO water?
RO water is not quite as efficient as distillation and post filtering. It gets most of the stuff, but it's not quite as pure. That's why for laboratory where you need just H2O, they use distillation. But for drinking purposes, any of those are generally going to get most of the materials. The other thing with reverse osmosis, you have to change those membranes or you start losing efficiency. And you also want to get things like cryptosporidium and other contaminants that can show up in water. Distillation does that, and heat processing, you know, gets rid of a lot of those potential contaminants.
What about these new water machines that make water from humidity?
Well, it's interesting. I don't know that there's any great utility or efficiency there, but they take it out of the air, so that's fine. And you can spend thousands of dollars for a Keegan water system, and they'll tell you that they're going to magically make it
Alkaline, yeah.
alkaline, etc. And if I don't think that that's necessary or even desirable, but you could throw baking soda in water and alkalize it. It doesn't necessarily make it.
But if you
There's no
get
magic there.
but if you get the water from the humidity, does that matter the quality of the air, or that has no play in it, or you don't even know that technology?
Well, I think I mean, you'll have to check with those people.
Yeah,
I have no experience using
sure.
these devices, but I don't see any great utility in drawing it from the air. I imagine you have the same potential cross contamination issues, but
Yeah. So, onto the fasting part, is there any disease that you would recommend somebody when you say if somebody's a candidate for fasting, when wouldn't somebody be a candidate for fasting in your opinion?
oh, all kinds of people are not candidates for fasting. You don't fast people that can't be stabilized off medication. People that are, for example, on anticoagulant therapy. If you just stop that, you increase their risk for stroke
What kind
with
of
devastating
therapy?
consequences.
What kind of therapy?
Anticoagulant therapy. People that have had myocardial infarction, PE, pulmonary embolism, DVT. If they're on anticoagulant therapy and you just stop the drug, you can induce a stroke. If you fast them on the drug, you can induce a bleed. The drugs can be greatly potentiated. They're toxic enough in the fed state, in the fasting state, they can become much more devastating. For example, ibuprofen, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories that somebody might get away with feeding. Not that it's good, but it can be dramatically more damaging fasting in terms of kidney disease and liver effects. So you don't fast on medications, but you can't just necessarily arbitrarily stop all medications overnight because that can create problems of themselves. Some conditions may be complicated in fasting, like I said, atrial fibrillation, for example. You may make some things worse. People that have ulcerative colitis can have hydration challenges fasting. So, you have to know the history exam and lab data in order to determine is a person even a good candidate for water only fasting. And then if they are a good candidate, they still have to rest and hydrate. And many people fasting on their own, they're too active or they get into trouble because of that. And then even if they fast successfully, they have to refeed carefully. And that's why it takes 10 days, or I should say half the length of the fast.
You lost the connect. Oh, there you go.
How to refeed without getting yourself into post-fasting edema or refeeding syndrome. That can even be fatal theoretically.
Sure. So, a person that's not a candidate, do you work them up to become a candidate, or
Of course, what you're doing then is you focus on the diet and the lifestyle changes. It may be slower, it may be harder, but that doesn't mean you can't improve health. It just means that you have to approach it with, you don't necessarily do water only fasting.
or can they eventually reach a place where they can become a candidate for the fasting?
Any of them will recover to the point where they can. What's really ironic is many of these patients that we're working with, by the time they're ready to fast, they don't even need to fast. They've actually recovered from their issues. And they're, now we're back into kind of short-term health promotion mode rather than disease recovery mode. I
So if
had
I
several patients that qualified for our Mayo Clinic study where we were treating hypertension. By the time they came in, where we could get an opening, they'd already normalized their blood pressure, didn't qualify for the study because they just followed the diet. If you eat the diet, you do the lifestyle, you get well. Fasting can make it happen quicker. And there may be
Sure.
conditions that are hard to get them to reverse without the fasting, but generally, health is about diet, sleep, and exercise. Fasting is just a tool to facilitate the process.
If somebody comes to you that's pretty healthy and living according to all the principles you talked about for many years, I mean, at the times people come to you say, you just don't need to fast. If you want to do it, I'll do it, but you don't really need one. Are
Yeah.
there times that
Well, we
happens?
often see that people benefit, even healthy people. We did a study looking at metabolically healthy people, what happens to them, and it turns out proportionally they got as much or more improvement than sick people. So what we do is we fast for a week, and if they're stable, then that's it. We're done. If they have symptoms that come up with fasting, because fasting is diagnostic as well, we'll continue, fasting until the problems are resolved. But for most healthy people, they're just fine. They're stabilized. They fast a week, they move on. But it provides benefit. Like I fast every year for a week, and it's profound the impact that it has on people, even though they may not be toxic waste dumps like people
Sure.
traditionally are.
When you start to put somebody on a fast, you say, look, we'll go up to 30 or 40 days, but we're not going to plan a number here. We're going to see how you respond to a week
We
first.
never know how long to fast until you see how you fast. What we do though is we cap it. We can look at their size and weight and say, look, we're not going to probably be fasting longer than X. But, we might think 3 weeks, but it ends up being 7 days. And you might think it's going to be 7 days, but it needs to go a little bit longer. So we always plan for the longest we think you might need, and then you can shorten it. Like, there's no cost at the center for getting done early. So if somebody books 4 weeks, they only need 6 days, it's 6 days. That's it. But it's hard to extend stays because we tend to be booked out. So we always give a little buffer in the scheduling so that they can do whatever they want to do.
Sure. I'm very interested in what you said about ulcerative colitis because that's what got me into health. I
Yep.
suffered from that when I was 19 years old. I went to Hippocrates Health Institute and
Right.
thankfully got better and been better since. But I have a passion of helping people with this, and I speak to a lot of people with inflammatory bowel disease. So tell us about ulcerative colitis or Crohn's
Yeah.
disease and fasting.
So any of these autoimmune diseases, it's essentially your body's attacking itself. And in the case of ulcerative colitis, there are certain food factors that aggravate patients with colitis. Number one is dairy proteins. Dairy products like gasoline on the fire of inflammation. And I don't see any colitis patients that don't seem to benefit from getting rid of dairy products in all forms. Number two is glutinous grains, wheat, rye, barley. These proteins, for whatever reason, tend to be an exciting factor for the majority of people that have autoimmune disease. And so we don't use any of those grains in people. Sugar and refined carbohydrates alters the gut microbiome. A healthy gut has 1,000 strain of organisms keeping each other in balance. Meat eaters, for example, have completely different organisms than plant eaters. People with eating sugar and stuff have different organisms. So we want our patients with colitis and autoimmune disease on vegan diets. So no meat, fish, fowl, eggs, or dairy products. And we don't use any salt, oil, or sugar. Remember, the microbiome is a very delicate, balanced situation in the body, and it's dominant. There's maybe 5 pounds of organisms in the gut. There's actually more non-human cells than human cells making up a human body. And to keep those organisms in balance is determined by what you feed them. If you feed them meat, fish, fowl, eggs, and dairy products, you're going to have a gut full of TMA, which becomes trimethylamine oxidase, highly irritating, inflammatory. If you feed them whole plant food diet, you're going to end up with 1,000 strain of organisms giving you fertilizer like vitamin K. So what we want to do is get the diet right. Now, for people with active ulcerative colitis, they can't always just go on a large amount of raw food because it can be really exciting and irritating. So we may use more steamed and starchy vegetables at first. Think about this, like foods that you can feed an infant are often foods you can feed a person with ulcerative colitis. So steamed, starchy vegetable materials, sweet potatoes, smaller amounts of, say, avocado, other things that they might be able to digest. But what we aren't doing is going in feeding them, say, large amounts of raw salad, because that can be irritating, exciting, cause aggravation. Once the gut heals, then you slowly introduce more and more raw materials. And many ulcerative colitis patients, once they're stable, are able to eat a whole plant food, estrus-free mixed diet, lots of raw fruits and vegetables, and do fine. But early on, you have to be really careful. Even fasting, you have to be careful with, because they're very vulnerable to dehydration and other problems. These are patients that need to be exceptionally carefully managed medically in order to avoid running into problems, even trying to do the right thing. But then once you get off the toxic drugs that are used, the steroids, the methotrexate, all that stuff, the Remicade, and they're stable, the problem is, and the good thing is, they can't really get away with eating crap because it'll flare up their condition, because you're not curing ulcerative colitis, you're managing it. And so they make good patients because they kind of can't have no choice but to keep eating healthy, otherwise they end up bleeding again. And once you've had 22 bloody bowel movements a day, you really don't want to live like that. And so they're highly motivated. So very difficult to treat initially, but once they're well, they tend to make good patients. The problem with colitis, though, is it's not just diet. Stress issues, stress hormones, these sleep deprivation, all of these things can aggravate the condition. So people have to be committed to being healthy and living healthy in order to stay healthy. They can't just take the magic diet pill and figure that that's going to solve everything. So it's the best and the worst condition. The people that get it and recover from it tend to be the most compliant and do well long term. But it's probably the hardest conditions to overcome, in terms of managing it. It's very difficult.
You've just recapped my life because I had it bad, and I'm so disciplined, and people say how. I say, well, what you just said motivates me. It's just, if I mess up, I don't want to go back to.
Yeah, you don't really have a choice. You're stuck
Yeah,
into it.
and
So
which
yeah,
is fine. I love this lifestyle, so I don't
yeah.
mind at all. But getting over that mental aspect of the food and everything, it's I
Right, and
know.
that's hard
Yeah.
because medical doctors will tell you diet doesn't matter, eat whatever you want, and nobody ever gets well.
Yeah. The thing is they give you this option, cut out your colon and then you can go eat whatever you want and you'll be
Oh,
fine.
yeah, yeah.
And a
Of
lot
course,
of
that
people
turns out not to be true.
yeah,
That's not true.
exactly, exactly. It's just terrible. So
Same thing with gallbladder disease. Cut out the gallbladder and you keep eating French fries, but then it turns out, no, you can't. Yeah, it's even
yeah,
worse. So.
it's amazing. So, all right. So you keep saying SOS free, salt, oil, and sugar. And we know I understand the oil, I understand the sugar, and just so everyone understands, there are healthy sugars like fruit that people think about sugar. That's okay. He's talking about processed refined sugar, right?
Yeah, refined
Yeah.
carbohydrates.
So when it comes to salt, now that's a very controversial one because there's
No, no,
different.
it's not too controversial. The reality is salt is an essential nutrient without which you die. You have
Mhm.
to have enough sodium. But it turns out you get enough sodium in your diet just like you get enough sugar in your diet and you get enough protein in your diet. And you get
Sure.
enough essential fatty acids in your diet. You don't have to add salt. And adding salt adds a complicating factor because you need, according to the American Cardiology Association, 500 milligrams. Other people say maybe 1,000 milligrams. You get the salt you need. When you get more salt, it stimulates passive overeating. So if you sit down and just eat your fill of something, let's say potato, you'll eat a certain amount and then your natural satiety mechanism kicks in and you don't want it anymore. But you salt it up, you'll eat significantly more before you feel satisfied or satiated. And people say, yeah, because it tastes better. And that's what tasting better means, stimulating dopamine production in your brain. And it's an artificial drug like effect. And that's why salt makes people fat, even though there's no calories in salt. So by getting rid of the excess salt, number one, you normalize blood pressure because you don't hold the extra fluid to neutralize yourself from the toxic effect of excess salt. You don't disrupt your gut microbiome. Think about your gut. 5 pounds of creatures running around in there. What do they use salt for? As a preservative. It kills off the organism so the meat doesn't rot. Well, what do you think a big salty bolus does in the human gut? You think it doesn't affect the bacteria and microorganisms that live there? Certainly it does. And it stimulates passive overeating. So excess salt is a major problem. Excess sugar is a major problem. Excess oil is a major problem. So all of those things, in our opinion, have to go in order to promote optimum health.
And when you talk about the salt, it doesn't matter if it's these new fancy salts or table salt, it's all the same. Any
Salt is
extra
salt is
salt is
salt. It
salt.
all dissociates into sodium chloride. Now you get the sodium. If you're healthy and your palate's not perverted, and you eat Swiss chard, you eat tomatoes, you eat celery, you can taste the sodium there. You're designed to detect sodium because it's an essential nutrient. You need it. You just don't need unlimited amounts of it.
Sure. Absolutely. Okay, so when you do blood test and blood work, CRP measures the inflammation markers in the body. So do you see this coming down tremendously after people fast or always or
Well, there's a
sometimes?
number of acute phase reactive proteins, high sensitivity CRP, sed-rates, fibrinogen, there's ferritin, there's all kinds of acute phase reactive proteins. And every one of those, in my experience, tends to reduce with fasting. Well, first of all, remember, during fasting, a lot of healing takes place. So you may see increases in sed-rates and CRP during fasting. And then as the body heals itself, and as you come off the fast and you follow those patients, their overall inflammation goes down. So fasting increases inflammation oftentimes initially, and then it helps the body actually resolve the condition. It's chronic inflammation where the body's not healing the problem that the problem is. Inflammation itself is a positive attempt by the body to recover. It's just when it's not working that the problem is. So the medical profession says, well, just give up. We'll suppress the immune system with steroid medication, and then you'll feel better. And at first, it's like a dream. And then it becomes a nightmare because it turns out you need your immune system. And when you shut your immune system off long term, you get big problems.
So when you say it increases, you talk about like the detoxification process. It'll increase and then it'll decrease.
Yeah, oh yeah, fasting. And that's why with an active ulcerative colitis patient that's bleeding, we typically wouldn't do fasting. We would feed them and do a slower approach until they're stabilized, and then we would use the fasting to get the deep healing. You don't necessarily turn the flame up even higher while they're in an active mode of inflammation.
Would juicing, I know blended soft foods, blended foods, and baby foods would be great, but would juicing, like, it's a form of eating with the least form of roughage.
Well, if we're juicing vegetable-based juices and stuff and broths and things, yeah, that might be a factor. I'd be a little careful about too much fruit juices with colitis
Yeah,
patients, though, can be really
absolutely.
aggravating, and so especially citrus juice and things that you just nightmare stuff.
Sure.
So Ulcerative colitis patients are a little easier to work with than most people because they can tell right away if what you're telling them is working. They can feel it, they can see it, they can, it's easy to monitor. A lot of conditions, they don't know if it's what's working isn't working,
Yeah, yeah.
and people are clouded by what their desires. Like they love the dead Dr. Atkinstein because they get to keep eating greasy, fatty, slimy foods. They can feed their addiction. They can have their, the foods that they really want to have. And yet they may lose some weight initially or whatnot, so they can justify that they're getting better. And again, because they got rid of ultra processed foods, like pretty much anything you do that gets rid of ultra processed foods is going to start demonstrating some positive results.
I know a Russian doctor years ago that had success treating people with ulcerative colitis with something called urine therapy, which seems so far against like
Anything you do that gets rid of refined carbohydrates, even something stupid like making people drink urine, is going to probably improve, compared to whatever they were doing.
sure.
So if you can't do better than standard American diet, whatever you're doing is pretty bad because, they've already gotten it about as bad as it can get.
Yeah, got you, got you. So what about things people are using today? What's your opinion about something like sea moss, which is very popular?
Which one?
Sea moss, it's like a vegetable from the ocean that people are using for nutrients and
Yeah, I'd be careful. I mean, any sea vegetable material, you got to be really careful about contamination issues and stuff. And again, whole plant foods, it's really simple. Take whole plant foods, eat the diet. And if you want to include small amounts of sea vegetables and you're trying to get a reliable source that's not contaminated, that might be fine. It's certainly a source of iodine and rich minerals and all that stuff. But again, for most people, they're selling something, but the power isn't what they're selling. It's the not eating meat, fish, dairy products, also on sugar.
sure. Uh, do you use chia seeds at all in your program?
We do. I mean, chia seeds, like flax seeds, are rich sources of fatty acids. I have to say, I'm not a big chia seed fan personally. I can't get over the chia plants as a kid and the slimy. I
Yes.
don't know. It's just, but I know that a lot of vegan advocates like Chef AJ, talk about chia seeds and how to use them in recipes and different things. And I don't have any problem with them. I just have personal. I don't like them.
Well, I was gonna ask, like flax seeds are better grounded up. Uh,
Yeah,
a
yeah.
chia
You
seed,
can't digest them whole. They're going to show up in your
a
stools.
chia seed's better grounded up.
I believe they can be soaked, but again, I don't work with chia seeds, but
Got you. Because they're soaked, like flax seeds are soaked in flax crackers and things like that. But
yeah, and that
yeah.
probably helps some, but I don't know, we always grind, flax into powder and then it's easily digested.
Do you believe all nuts and seeds should be soaked?
Well, if you soak nuts and then it make them easier to chew up, what I tend to do with nuts, though, is, either chew really thoroughly, and we tend to grow walnuts, so we tend to use walnuts. So we keep them in the shell and then shell them and eat them, or grind them into powder, blend them into a dressing, or put them on like that. And that way, you don't have to be quite as diligent in order to get those broken down. And if you start seeing bits of nuts in your stools, you're not chewing well enough to get them broken down.
Sure. If somebody wanted to work at True North, I'm going to put the address below and the phone number where to contact them below everybody. But if they're not able to get there, do you have any type of online preparation
Yes,
program for them? Explain
yes.
that, how that
So
works.
one thing we wrote this book called "Can Fasting Save Your Life," which has all the information a patient and their physician needs in order to get people through fasting. And so we would recommend they read that book and share it with their doctor. And then we have doctors that provide telemedicine support. And the telemedicine support allows us to provide individual support to a patient that's trying to do remote fasting. We also have a free service, though, that's really useful. If you go onto our website at truenorthhealth.com and complete the registration forms, I offer a free phone conversation to make sure you're a good candidate for fasting, point you in the right direction, try to hook you up with a doctor that's able to be supportive of you. Or if you decide to come to True North Health Center, we can help you with those details as well. If you're going to do the fasting remotely, though, you have to follow the same protocol. You have to history exam with your local doctor, make sure you're a candidate, get the lab so you have baseline data. You have to rest so you're not working, you're not running, driving, you're not putting yourself and other people at risk. You have to stay hydrated. And then you need to terminate your fast according to protocol so that you don't get yourself sick. And our doctors can provide daily support to you in doing that and can provide support to your physician along with the book so that they understand, blood testing and other things that can be done to make sure that you have a safe and effective experience. Not everybody is a good candidate for fasting, and not everybody's a candidate for home fasting. But that's something we can help you determine without any cost just by letting us using our free screening service.
When you say rest, what do you mean by rest?
So you're not driving, exercising, you're not increasing your heart rate or doing things that cause you to go into a sweat. Now you're not just laying in bed. You can walk around your house, you can do a little yoga, you can do your meditation, you can certainly do a little reading, but you shouldn't be like doing your taxes or dealing with really high stress. You're not raising your children and putting up with teenagers or whatever while you're trying to fast. It's going to be really difficult. You want to be in an environment of rest.
Well, shouldn't we be in that environment, like, always, like, try to figure out a way to get there so we don't tap into that stress, even if we are raising up kids, walking the dog, we're not doing
Well,
it.
yeah, obviously stress management's important, but the reality is in fasting, you're particularly vulnerable and you can't do the normal things that you would do. And when you're eating, you can drive a car and you can go to work and you can do all those things. But when you're fasting, it's a period of rest and recuperation if you want the best result.
Sure. Now, if somebody's experienced with fasting and stress management, would it hold true as well? Like, can they get away? I'm not talking about the vigorous exercise, but then can they get away with a little bit more or no?
Well, I think that the best result is, relatively passive because here's the problem. Every calorie you burn excessively, beyond baseline, forces gluconeogenesis. So you'll lose more weight, but that weight is going to be lean tissue and not fat. What we want to do is maximize fat and visceral fat loss and minimize protein loss. Now, for healthy, thin people, they're not going to be fasting that long, so it's not going to be as big of an issue. But for people that are recovering from health issues, this is what we typically see. These are longer fasts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. And so, for those people, they need to take it seriously. This can be you can create some real serious problems with people. And I know I get those calls every week where well intentioned but misguided people have really screwed themselves up. With fasting, it's what gives fasting a bad name. It's not fasting, it's inappropriately applied fasting. That's why we wrote the book, Can Fasting Save Your Life? Is it something relevant to you? And if you're going to do it, how to do it properly.
Okay. And your book's on your website, correct?
Books everywhere.
Good.
Amazon, your local bookstores, certainly available through TrueNorth Health. Um, but for nowadays, people can go on to Amazon and just they can get it. Boom.
Okay. Couple more questions, and then we're done. So, what about going to the bathroom and fasting? Like, what could a person expect? Because I've done fast,
Yeah.
and a week later after fasting, I had a bowel movement. And you're like, where did this come from? Uh,
Oh
you
yeah.
know,
Well,
so
remember, bowel is mostly bacteria. So and also whatever fibers, circublinogen, other materials. And so your body, as it needs to evacuate, will continue to evacuate during fasting. It obviously is going to slow down. Eventually, there may not be enough material to trigger a bowel movement, which is fine until you come off the fast. We don't advocate colonics and bowel stimulation and all kinds of other stuff. And certainly don't take bentonite, have that blow up in your gut, and have
sure.
somebody convince you that it's some impacted material. Just like we don't recommend people swallow a bunch of olive oil and lemon juice and then have your gallbladder throw up soap balls and pretend that they're gallstones. So there's a lot of hocus pocus out there. We're not advocating any of that.
So, is it normal for a person to fast and not go to the bathroom at all during the fast, or
Yeah, bowel movements may cease, or certainly you may have one and then not have another for until you come off the fast, but you'll continue to urine past urine. If you don't and become dehydrated, then you can shut your kidneys down and die. So we recommend not doing that because it'll mess up the outcome data.
but
So
you?
you have to stay hydrated, but just forcing fluids doesn't help either because you can flush out your electrolytes. That's why when people fast, they want to take advantage of the benefits of urine and blood testing weekly and have an examination done on a daily basis where you're collecting vitals and having either our doctor remotely or your doctor locally available to provide support so you don't make a mess of it.
But you don't recommend colonics and enemas during a fast.
We don't recommend colonic enemas during fasting. Occasionally, post-fasting, people have an impaction issue because they didn't follow advice before fasting properly. You might have to do an enema. But again, we want to try to minimize that by proper pre-feeding before the fast. It's very important that the bowel movements be normally established before you go on the fast so that we don't have impaction issues and create a mess.
What about herbal cleanses and that claim they get rid of the mucoid plaque and things like this? Do you?
Yeah, that's a nonsense. We don't recommend putting a bunch of irritation in your colon. and overstimulating the bowel. So we're not recommending herbal cleansers or other things like that for people that are fasting. But again, if you read Can Fasting Save Your Life, you'll really understand the rationale behind what we recommend and what we don't recommend.
Okay. And what's your opinion, the best way to break a fast if somebody's fasting long term
Well, it
or even
depends on
short
their
term?
history.
Yeah.
It depends on their history, but typically we do a day of vegetable and juices and broth for every week of fasting. So if a person had a 2-week fast, they'd have a couple days of juice. It'd be mostly vegetables, maybe a little bit of apple or something, get a little bit of carbohydrate in to get them out of the fasting mode. And then we would introduce raw fruits and vegetables, except if they're active ulcerative colitis patients, we might introduce steamed and starchy vegetable materials. But for most people, it's raw fruit and vegetables one day for every week of fasting. And then we introduce steamed and starchy vegetables. Or if it was a colitis patient, we might then introduce a little bit of raw vegetable material, a little grated carrot or something we know that they're not likely to react poorly to.
Well, you're
And
talking about
then
it.
as their
Okay.
energy comes up, we introduce maybe more concentrated foods, a little bit of nuts and seeds, more concentrated steamed starchy vegetables, eventually maybe grains or beans if they're able to digest those things. And so if a 20-day fast, it would take about 10 days of progressive refeeding. And we have those charts all laid out so they can depending on how length of the fast depends on the length of the refeeding. And also it depends a little bit on their condition. Healthy people doing a week-long fast may recover very quickly in a couple days. A person that's a little bit more delicate, a 3-week fast might take them, as long as that fast was in order to fully recover. So you have to have a little bit of individual variation.
When you say with the colitis patients, it's a little bit different. Is that somebody who's an active flare, or even somebody who's not in an active flare? You would still be cautious.
Well, we're not going to be in an active flare. We would have stabilized them before we put them on the fast. But even those patients that are not in active flare, we don't want them to flare. And so we're going to be exquisitely careful, what we call a high sensitivity refeed. It's a different refeeding protocol that we use for people that have had that history. And it's a little slower and, people get a little impatient, but it's safer because you just don't run the chance of causing a little bit of activation. Because, when you go on a fast, you dump a lot of bile and other toxic materials, and those materials are passing and they can be very irritative. And so we just got to, be very careful with, especially ulcerative colitis patients. These are very delicate patients.
Are you talking about like recently inactive, like somebody like me for 20 years with no issue?
No, no, no. You're
Am I
not going to have
normal
the
now?
problems because you're 20 years without a flare. You're not going to be flaring. That's.
Yeah. So
But
I'm
the point is, if you're able to eat, say, raw fruits and vegetables normally before fasting, then you're going to be able to eat raw fruits and
right.
vegetables after
Right.
fasting. But if you were, say, you've recently recovered from an acute flare up, we would be exquisitely
Got
careful.
it. Got it. Okay.
And even with you, we wouldn't just say eat a pound of salad. You know what I mean? We would do something consistent with what your feeding program before the fast is. We knew that you could function well with.
Sure. I'm going to mention in closing two popular, but well, one book's popular, one's not about fasting. For your opinion about it. And one of them is The Miracle of Fasting by Paul Braggs. What's your opinion about that book?
Well, it's a wonderful historical classic. Paul, this book was written a long time ago, before we had the benefits of a lot of the research. Like if you read Can Fasting Save Your Life, it's all based on most of the research we've done. But this has really good modern explanations. Paul Bragg's content is great. It's just, it's more of a historical classic. It's like Herbert Shelton.
Sure.
Fasting can save your life. These are great, interesting books that are more philosophically driven, not necessarily scientifically driven. And I think if Paul Bragg were alive today, he would be writing something that looked more like Can Fasting Save Your Life.
Sure. This other book I found that I love. It's by a fellow named Reverend Franklin Hall, the Atomic Power with God of Fasting and Prayer. Have you ever heard of it?
I don't believe I've read this one.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I'm not intimately familiar with
Yeah,
that. I don't
it's
believe.
it's an older book, and it talks really about fasting and prayer. It's a religious book,
Right.
but it's like Paul Bragg's book. It's excellent by Reverend Franklin Hall, and he did a lot of books on fasting back in the day. Uh, just similar to Paul Bragg stuff, a lot of good information, but not scientific because it was so
Well, and the
hard.
Bible has 1,100 references to fasting. They say Moses, David, Elijah, and Jesus fasted for up to 40 days, and so did our patients. So I tell them they're in good company.
Exactly, exactly. And very well, very well. Well, thank you so much for your time. Dr. Goldhammer and everybody. I'm going to put the link below to True North. I've personally been there. I actually saw people there. I didn't go there as a patient, but I met you back then. It was a long time ago. And I follow your work, and everybody, I'm telling you, if you're sick, you have an illness, this is definitely something you want to check out. Now, would you 100% of the times people recommend the first thing of disease? Let's say somebody gets diagnosed with cancer. Should you be the first person they call? And I'm not boasting you, I mean True North, or do you think they should look at other detox centers or doctors, or is your
Well,
do
I
you feel
think it's good for people to look at all of their choices. They should talk to their oncologist and find out what their recommendations are. But you always ask the oncologist this question: where's the evidence that you're using to recommend your chemotherapy, radiation, whatever surgery that shows that people actually live longer or better if they do it? So, in other words, if you're making a recommendation where I have to have my colon removed, there must be some data that shows that people that do that do a lot better than people that don't. And you sometimes will be surprised by the answer that they'll give you that maybe there's not so much support for some of the recommended recommendations of therapy. That's number one. Two, you should look at your different options. There's lots of people willing to sell you all kinds of therapies, pills, potions, powders, treatments. Take a look at that. And then there's the more extreme versions like us at TrueNorth Health, where we don't really have any pill, potion, powder to sell you. It's all about healthful living. And then you decide what you're most comfortable trying to pursue. We're not for everybody. Listen, what we're involved with requires tremendous work on the part of the patient. They have to make diet changes, lifestyle changes. They have to be willing to exercise. They have to get enough sleep. There's no quick fix, easy answer, long term. It's a long term strategy that is only really for the most motivated people. But if you're motivated like that, then we can be helpful. If you're not, then go to one of the places that'll give you the quick fix.
do you have in the from what I remember when I was there, you had televisions in some of the rooms or all of the rooms, do you?
Well, we have flat panel TVs in all the rooms now because we live stream all of our lectures. So if people are wanting to rest and not come down to the lecture hall, they can still participate by turning on the live streaming. We also have a Roku channel. Again, our live streaming and Roku channel is available to everybody without cost. It's not monetized, whether you're at the center or just through our website. But that allows our patients to participate without having to necessarily coming down and interacting with everybody. Sometimes in fasting, people want to really take it easy. And the Roku channel has a lot of recorded video. Again, it's all free, it's all readily accessible. So during the fast, in addition to the live lectures, we have a lot of recorded materials that people can go through, as well as, they interact with each other. We have 70 people from around the world there, staying in a facility that's designed to support fasting supervision.
What's the name of your Roku channel?
It's True North Health.
Should know that. Now, do you recommend people that are fasting at home stay away from the standard TV or?
Well, standard TV is really a problem when you're fasting because there's nothing but food commercials for ultra processed food. So it can be a little bit distracting. So, it's not something I would advocate for anybody, fasting or not. I think that, we use the television to broadcast the educational materials. And so we find that really useful, and so do the patients.
Yeah, but now the truth be told, I mean, once a person's fasting, after a couple of days or maybe longer for somebody else, you kind of lose your appetite. You don't really crave
Right.
food.
Many of our patients come to cooking classes. They come down to the dining hall and interact with other people, even though they haven't eaten for 3 weeks. They just like the social interaction. And you'd think, oh, it'd be so hard, but it's not because they're fasting. They have a hunger blunting mechanism that kicks in with fasting. So hunger usually isn't really the big problem.
I personally find the first 2 or 3 days are the hardest, but after that, it's easy. Is that common or no to not get like tempted?
Well, I don't think it's ever easy for people that are on conventional programs. You have the benefit of having lived healthfully, so you don't get the really exciting healing crises that, somebody else might. And so fasting can be really, really difficult. But for healthy people, yeah, it's usually not that big of a problem.
Yeah,
I
great.
don't like it because you have to restrict your activities. I just don't like giving up all the fun things I do every day. And, so I don't like fasting, but, I do it every year or so,
So would you say a week every year you do it?
Yeah, that's what we do. The model right now is fast for a week. If you don't have a healing crisis, you're probably okay.
Got you, got you. And how does somebody know if they have a healing crisis? They'll know, or can
Oh,
sometimes?
you'll know.
I mean, could it sometimes be so subtle where they don't know, or not really?
Well, if it's that subtle, maybe it's not that big of a problem. But we're looking at clinical symptoms and lab symptoms. You're getting the blood and urine tests, you're getting the physical exam. At TrueNorth Health Center, doctors examine patients twice a day. We're looking at those patterns. We're looking at blood pressure and vitals, including respiratory issues and pulse ox, and just different measures of how a person's functioning, as well as how they're doing clinically. We've done this a few times. What 25,000 people having gone through the fasting process, you know what to look for, and the patterns that you see.
Are these medical doctors that are working on your staff?
Yeah, we have medical doctors, naturopathic physicians, physicians assistants, nurses. We have 70 people on our staff. A dozen of them are clinicians, and we have 5 doctors that are what are called attendings. So everybody's under the care of at least one of our attendings. 2 of those are MDs. One of them is a PA, and 2 of them are NDs.
Does it ever or has it ever happened where the person needed to go to the hospital, or that never
Yes.
happened? Yeah. So explain
No,
that.
no, absolutely. We have a lot of people that are very, very sick. Most of the people that have to get medical support, though, are coming in with conditions that have nothing to do with fasting. It has to do with the fact that they're on complicated medications and run into difficulties, or they pass gallstones or the kidney stones or something, and you want to get a diagnostic workup done. Or if a person does become dehydrated and needs intravenous feeding, we don't do intravenous feeding at TrueNorth. We'll do it at the hospital where they'll get evaluation. So, about 1 per 1,000 fasting patients have what are called adverse events or medical complications. Most of those are hydration related. I can tell you in the last 5 years, there's been 8 patients that have had to be hospitalized. Half of them are electrolyte. You have to do IV to get their electrolytes up. Or there's something that comes up that we're not sure what it is, and so we'll get a specialist to help us diagnostically. Because we're really conservative. We want to make sure everybody that walks in can walk out.
Do you have a relationship with a local hospital where if that comes up, you you know somebody or they know the process, or is it or are they against you at that hospital? Almost like home births, like they don't want
Well, it
anything to
depends.
yeah.
We have a number of local hospitals, depending on what the condition is. Depending on which hospital that we use. We have some of the hospitalists that are very supportive that get food from us and like what we do. We have some of the overweight nurses at one of the local hospitals that think we're crazy and hate us. One of our patients, I think, one time went in and suggested that they might benefit from True North Health, and that really pissed them off. But so what we do is considered crazy. You also have to remember the hospitals only get a chance to see the 1 per 1,000 that have complications. So everybody they see in relation to the fasting clinic is having a problem. So of course their experience there is going to be biased by that. So I wouldn't necessarily expect all medical personnel to be highly excited and supportive of the clinic that's telling patients that everything they're being told medically, is a pile of crap, and they want to get off the drugs, and that there's no magic cures and all that stuff. So clearly there's some mixed reactions of our local medical community to our work. I think some think we're criminal quacks, and some think we're doing really valuable work.
Well, thank you very much. Before we end, is there anything you want to share with the audience?
No, just if you go to our website at truenorthhealth.com, there's a lot of educational content that's freely available. And again, if you want to have a conversation with me, fill out the forms and give me a call.
Great. Do you do consultations just besides people going there? Do you do consultations in your work, or is that something?
We do. We have all of our attendings offer telemedicine services. So if you want to have a doctor that's not an idiot, kind of help you go over and make some coaching decisions, you can access any of them. They're all described. You can pick the one that you resonate the most with. People can talk to me without any cost. But what I'm able to do is a screening consultation, kind of point you in the right direction, make sure you're a good candidate, get you to a doctor that maybe can be of some help.
Great. Thank you so much for your time, and keep up the great work you're doing. I'm so glad.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nature's wealth, good for your health. This is the raw life health.